Hello everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel, The Political Report. So here on your screen, you can actually see the topic for today's video, which is going to be a coverage and a recap from the Texas U.S. Senate Republican primary runoff, in which incumbent Attorney General for the state of Texas, Ken Paxton, was facing off against four-term incumbent John Cornyn, who is an incumbent U.S. Senator from the state of Texas. Now, at the time of recording, the primary runoff has just been called, in which Ken Paxton ended up blowing John Cornyn out the water, winning by around 28 percentage points, and depending where the votes left ultimately end up being counted, depending on when this video is uploaded, you could actually see Ken Paxton winning by possibly even 30 percentage points, depending on how the votes end up in Houston, Fort Worth, and Dallas. But since the results have already been called and Ken Paxton has been declared the winner of this race, I wanted to recap this election and what it means for my analysis for the 2026 U.S. Senate election that will be occurring in November. So the results here are actually very, very different from the results we saw earlier this year in March, in which John Cornyn ended up exceeding expectations, actually beating out Ken Paxton by around 1.2 percentage points in the state of Texas. Now, a lot of this was because Wesley Hunt's vote share actually was much lower than expected, with Wesley Hunt only getting approximately 13 percentage points in the state of Texas. When polling at the time had Wesley Hunt around the 20s, a lot of the Hunt voters that were supposedly voting in these polls actually ended up backing Cornyn, and Ken Paxton did not have the amount of support that the polls were previously showing. So going back to this runoff that was going to be occurring this month in May, it was really anyone's race. It was Ken Paxton versus John Cornyn. A lot of people thought it was going to be 50-50. And before this runoff even occurred, Ken Paxton actually ended up making an offer to Donald Trump and an offer to the Republican Party, in spite of the news that Donald Trump was possibly going to endorse John Cornyn over Ken Paxton because of Cornyn's overperformance. Ken Paxton actually made an ultimatum with the Republican Party that if John Cornyn and the Senate Republicans were able to overcome the filibuster and pass the Save America Act, in which they will require voter ID and non-citizens being banned from voting in all elections and requiring it at a federal level to be enforced in all states regardless of whatever their local laws are and their local ID laws are. Ken Paxton actually made the offer that if John Cornyn was willing to get that through before the runoff, that Ken Paxton will actually drop out and endorse Cornyn and save Donald Trump a lot of time and energy from making an endorsement in this race. And since Ken Paxton made that announcement, he ended up actually being correct because he was able to call the Republicans' bluff that the Republican senators were actually not going to pass the SAVE Act, regardless of all the virtue signaling they were going to do, that they were going to force a vote on the SAVE Act, and never actually ended up happening because of Senate leadership and a lot of holdouts within the Republican Party preventing the act from going to a vote. So Ken Paxton actually ended up calling the Republican Party's bluff and successfully convincing Trump to delay any endorsement of John Cornyn. Now, upon the news that John Cornyn and the GOP leadership within the United States Senate were not going to pass the SAVE Act, Donald Trump actually had enough of them and decided to endorse Ken Paxton over John Cornyn here in this election. So you can see here actually around 1 or 2 weeks ago, on the second day of early voting in the state of Texas, Trump decided to endorse Paxton in the state of Texas. And in this article, it says that he was gambling on a challenger with baggage in a crucial race. Now, for those of you who remember, back in 2023, Ken Paxton actually stood his own impeachment trial in the state of Texas, where the Republican-dominated House legislator in the state of Texas impeached Paxton. However, he was acquitted on all counts when it came to the Senate conviction votes. You can actually see here he was charged with multiple charges, actually accumulating all the way to 20 articles of impeachment. However, every single article failed, as the majority of the senators in the state of Texas acquitted Ken Paxton of all of the corruption charges and allegations he was facing at the time. Despite all of this, as BBC mentioned, Trump decided to endorse Paxton because he was fed up with Cornyn and the Republican Party failing to pass any of his agenda or his preferred legislation. Now, since that endorsement, I think the most interesting thing here is actually the margin. As you can see here on your screen, Ken Paxton was winning, or probably would have won by around 28 to 30 percentage points as of the recording. However, if you look back on the polling, you can actually see that after the runoff, Ken Paxton was only leading by around a few percentage points, as most people thought that Wesley Hunt voters would actually go to Ken Paxton once the runoff actually occurred. You can see here in all of these polls, he's winning from a few percentage points on average to maybe a maximum of 7 or 8 percentage points. Of course, with the Cornyn polls showing John Cornyn winning by a slim majority or a slim plurality of just 1 percentage point. However, you can see here that after Trump and Wesley Hunt decided to endorse Ken Paxton, that he was polling at around plus 22 to plus 10, depending on the poll. So Ken Paxton really got a late game surge at the last week or two of early voting in the state of Texas, where Ken Paxton was actually polling to lead by around 10 to maybe 15 percentage points looking at the poll. However, you can see that 10 to 15 percentage points is not what we actually have here, as Ken Paxton ultimately ended up winning by 28 percentage points, which is an incredible supercharged overperformance on the side of Ken Paxton, and really showed that he had the energy going downstream, and that it probably was not just Trump's endorsement or Wesley Hunt's endorsement, but rather the Republican Party having a major issue with John Cornyn himself, as John Cornyn is a more so moderate Republican who is in favor of red flag laws and banning a lot of gun rights in the United States, despite being a Republican from the state of Texas. Now, for the second part of the video, I wanted to cover the analysis for the November general election, where you can actually see here that Ken Paxton is actually behind a little bit in the polls against James Talarico. Now, if you look at the polls here from James Talarico, you can see it's all Democrat internals that are biased and support Talarico that show him leading, and then a very bad poll here for Paxton saying that he was down by around 8 percentage points, and another poor poll here for Paxton showing he's down by around 5 percentage points, until this most recent poll here from the state of Texas showing Ken Paxton actually tied with James Talarico after the primary elections occurred. Now, all of these polls are pretty old and around 1 to 3 months old because they are happening after the initial primary in the state of Texas. But you can actually see here that it's not just these polls, but actually the pundits that are saying that Ken Paxton might have a hard time beating James Talarico here. You can see here that within minutes of Ken Paxton being declared the winner of the Republican primary, that the Cook Political Report has actually shifted their margin to lean Republican after the Paxton runoff win from previously being likely Republican, showing that they think Ken Paxton might have a little bit of a harder time beating James Talarico. You can see the same thing here from the Sabados crystal ball, where within minutes of Ken Paxton winning the nomination, they actually moved Texas from likely R to lean R, signifying that they think Ken Paxton will probably win, but by only a few percentage points. Now, for Ken Paxton and the GOP, I really don't think this is something that they should really worry about, at least not as of yet. Because you can go all the way back to 2024 when Colin Allred was actually running against Ted Cruz, and Ted Cruz is honestly probably the most unlikable character within GOP politics in the entire country right now. And you can see that Colin Allred actually ended up underperforming the polls drastically. If you go very early on in the polling, they were showing Colin Allred actually being within the margin of error and or tied with Ted Cruz, possibly even beating him in the early polls. Now, the early polls in Texas are hilariously bad and inaccurate and typically favors the Democrats, because you can see, they even showed Allred winning in the morning consult poll by over 1 percentage point, and even showing him tied around 2 to 3 weeks before Election Day, when he ended up losing ultimately by around 9 percentage points at a very high turnout election, losing by 9 percentage points. So a lot of these early polls are heavily favored toward Democrats if you look at any recent history. But even if you just look at the fact that Donald Trump won the state by around 13.5 percentage points, the idea that James Talarico is some magical candidate that can overperform Kamala Harris by 13 to 14 percentage points in the state of Texas against Ken Paxton is honestly laughable for those who think that James Talarico is actually favored here. Because for James Talarico to end up becoming victorious, he will need to overperform Kamala Harris by around 14 percentage points, which is obviously an uphill battle to overperform Kamala Harris within just 2 years of the last election and make an over 14 percentage point shift in the state of Texas. Now, the closest a Democrat has ever come in the state of Texas in recent years was Beto O'Rourke against Ted Cruz in 2018. Now, for those of you who remember this election, Beto O'Rourke was LARPing and grifting as a moderate and or a possible conservative Democrat in the state of Texas, where in 2018 he was pretending to be pro-gun, pro-Second Amendment, pro a lot of somewhat conservative values in the state of Texas, and that really actually gave him a shot in the state of Texas in 2018. As you can see, he only ended up losing by around 2.5 percentage points to Ted Cruz in a state that was otherwise Trump plus 9 in the 2016 election. However, as I mentioned, 2016 was only Trump plus 9, and in 2024, it is now Trump plus 13 to 14 percentage points. So even though Beto O'Rourke at the time was seen as a perfect candidate, he still ended up losing by almost 3 percentage points. And all of Beto's grifting actually ended up coming to light when he ran for president in 2020, where he was actually campaigning on gun buybacks and confiscation of all assault rifles in the United States. which, as someone who was trying to run for governor of Texas in 2022, is a very idiotic thing to say if you're trying to beat a Republican in the state of Texas. You probably shouldn't be campaigning on banning all assault rifles and being anti-Second Amendment, which really shows that his entire 2018 campaign was really just a grift to try to get him elected, where he was LARPing as a moderate when in fact he wants to ban all assault rifles. So that really ended Beto O'Rourke's career in the state of Texas and nationally as a Democrat as a whole. However, things are actually worse for James Talarico, because at least in 2018, Republicans didn't really have that much ammunition to paint Beto O'Rourke as an extremist, because they saw Beto O'Rourke as a moderate Democrat or a possible centrist Democrat. Republicans really had a hard time, which is why Beto O'Rourke only lost by around 2.5 percentage points. However, now, 9 months before the election in March 2026, Republicans are actually campaigning over more of James Talarico's more controversial statements. They've actually combed through a lot of his Twitter posts, a lot of his social media, and a lot of his press coverages over the past 2 decades in the state of Texas, and have found a lot of clips and a lot of statements from James Talarico that is seen as more controversial or anti-Republican in the state of Texas, that is very religious. It's very much so part of the Bible Belt in the United States. It is a more so Republican state, and they just find more and more radical comments from James Talarico, or at least something that the Texas Tribune will call quote-unquote radical, where James Talarico has been clipped in doing press conferences in which he argues that Jesus or God is non-binary, which, if you're trying to LARP as a Democrat religious leader in the state of Texas and you're making statements like that, you can probably count the religious vote out the way for any conservative religious voters, among many other radical statements James Talarico has made in the past. So James Talarico doesn't have the same privilege that Beto O'Rourke even had in 2018, because in 2018, Republicans really didn't have anything against Beto O'Rourke. But now, 9 months before the election, Republicans have a mountain load of ammunition, of clips, and of videos, bad press coverage that they can unleash against James Talarico to label him as a extremist and or a radical, at least in comparison to the conservative beliefs of Texan voters. So that's why I think this election result is going to be very interesting, because Ken Paxton did win, and it did shift the race from being likely to lean R. However, I still think that Ken Paxton is definitely the favorite here and should be projected to win by a few percentage points. Now, the question is, how much money will Democrats end up wasting here or spending here? As you can see, Democrats have already put $40 million into James Talarico's campaign, whereas Ken Paxton has self-funded only around $7 million. And until now, the NRSC has completely abandoned Ken Paxton because they spent over $120 million to try to help John Cornyn, who was the incumbent. But now that John Cornyn is out the way and the NRSC is able to give money to the Ken Paxton campaign, this monetary advantage that James Talarico has is only going to shrink until then. So, where things currently stand, I think Ken Paxton is definitely favored and will probably end up squeaking out a win in November by around probably 3 to 7 percentage points, if I were to guess. So with that being said, everyone, that concludes my video on the Texas GOP 2026 Senate runoff primary, in which Ken Paxton ended up being victorious. Go ahead and leave a comment down below if you have any questions, or if you wanted to give your own prediction as to what you think the November result will be. Please leave a like on the video if you enjoyed, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you want to see more videos later this week. Thank you, and I'll see you all soon.